In many New York buildings, the elevator goes directly from 12 to 14. It looks as though an entire floor has vanished along the way, as if the building simply forgot how to count. But it is there. People walk through it, sleep on it, work on it, and eat breakfast on it. Almost no one, however, calls it the 13th floor. It is called 14, or 12A, or sometimes M, the letter occupying the 13th position in the Latin alphabet. A study published by Street Easy in 2020 analyzed 629 residential buildings in Manhattan with at least 13 stories. Only 9% officially labeled the 13th floor as 13. The other 91% skipped the number, renamed it, or disguised it. In a city that erected some of the most famous buildings in the world, supported by steel engineering, precise calculations, and rigorous safety codes, a superstition of uncertain origin still determines how floors are labeled. The question almost no one stops to ask is simple. How did such an ancient belief survive in such a modern place? To understand that, we must travel far back in time. Long before skyscrapers, before structural steel, before New York even existed, the ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia developed a counting system centered on the number 12. 4,000 years ago, 12 months in a year, 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 visible hours in the day. 12 was considered complete, balanced, and satisfying. 12 completes the year. It closes the circle. What came after it, 13, broke the symmetry. It was the number left over. This quiet unease surrounding 13 appears in small gestures throughout ancient history. A persistent legend, repeated in books of curiosities, claims that the Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1754 BC on a basalt stele now housed in the Louvre, deliberately omitted the 13th law from its list of 282 rules. It is a fascinating story, but historians have confirmed that it is false. The original cuneiform text did not number the laws at all. It was the translator L.W. King who numbered them for a modern edition in 1910 and left a gap because part of the stone had been damaged. The omission dates from the 20th century, not the second millennium BC. But the fact that the legend took hold, that people wanted to believe Hammurabi feared the number 13, already reveals how deeply this number affects the human mind. The true roots of the superstition are more recent and more cultural than mathematical. In Norse mythology, the gods were gathered for a banquet in Valhalla, with 12 seated at the table, when Loki, the god of trickery, arrived uninvited. He was the 13th guest. His arrival ended with the death of Balder, the most beloved god in the pantheon, and marked the beginning of the long decline that would lead to Ragnarok. In Christian tradition, the Last Supper brought together Jesus and his 12 disciples, 13 men around the table. And according to one popular interpretation, Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, was the 13th to sit down. The following day, a Friday, was the day of the crucifixion. It is no coincidence that the specific superstition surrounding Friday the 13th emerged centuries later, but the symbolic foundation of the idea was formed there. And there is a third episode, almost theatrical in its historical precision. In the early hours of Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the simultaneous arrest of the Knights Templar throughout his kingdom. Many were tortured, forced to make false confessions, and later burned alive. Historians debate how much this event actually contributed to the fear of combining Friday with the number 13, but the date undeniably acquired a symbolic weight that endured throughout the Renaissance. By the end of the Middle Ages, when the earliest tarot decks began circulating in Italy, the 13th card of the major arcana featured a skeleton holding a scythe. It was the death card. In 1781, the French occultist Antoine Court de Gebelin wrote that the number 13 was, in his words, always considered unfortunate. European popular culture had already absorbed the idea as an established truth. Its origins were no longer discussed. It was enough to know that the number brought trouble. This symbolic baggage, accumulated in scattered fragments over 3 millennia, crossed the Atlantic in the minds of the European immigrants who populated the east coast of the United States during the 19th century. And on the other side of the ocean, it encountered a city beginning to do something no one had ever done before: erect vertical buildings 10, 12, and 15 stories tall. The first skyscrapers appeared in Chicago during the early 1880s, but New York quickly caught up with and surpassed its rival. In 1900, the city received only 2 permit applications for buildings 13 stories or taller. By 1910, that number had risen to 16. By 1915, it had reached 28. The city was growing upward at a pace that frightened even experienced engineers. Architecture critics of the period published warnings in newspapers, arguing that buildings taller than 13 stories were unethical because they cast shadows over streets and neighboring properties, creating dark and uninhabitable urban corridors. The superstition surrounding 13 and the practical fear of building too high converged at the same historical moment. It was in this context that a discrete practice emerged among developers and property owners. If you owned a 15-story building, it was easier to sell or rent the units if you called the 13th floor something else. The unease among tenants was small, but it was real. And in a city where every apartment represented money, losing one superstitious buyer still meant losing a buyer. Curiously, the city's most famous buildings never adopted the practice. The Flatiron Building, opened in 1902, has an officially designated 13th floor. The Woolworth Building, completed in 1913, does as well. The Chrysler Building from 1930, the Empire State Building from 1931, the Waldorf Astoria, the Plaza Hotel, and later One World Trade Center all number their 13th floors without hesitation. These were landmark buildings, architectural statements whose prestige came from the structures themselves, not from their indifference toward a number. No one refused to rent an office in the Empire State Building because it was on the 13th floor. Prestige absorbed the superstition. But as skyscrapers multiplied across Manhattan, particularly residential towers and more modest hotels, the logic was reversed. Without a famous architectural name behind the project, the average developer had far more to lose than to gain by keeping the numbering honest. An educated resistance to the superstition emerged at almost exactly the same time. On January 13, 1881, a group of 13 men gathered in New York City to establish what became known as the 13 Club. The idea was to exercise the collective fear through humor and inverted rituals. The club's first dinner began at 8:13 in the evening, with 13 guests seated in room number 13 of the restaurant. To enter, participants had to walk beneath an open ladder and across a floor covered in spilled salt, 2 gestures Victorian superstition considered disastrous. Nothing bad happened. The club grew to more than 400 members over the course of its existence, including 5 American presidents, among them Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Theodore Roosevelt. New chapters of the 13 Club spread to other American cities during the following decades. But the Rationalist Club did not win. Gradually, it faded away. And while intellectuals tried to dismantle the legend with provocative dinners, popular culture moved in the opposite direction, reinforcing the idea that 13 really was a dangerous number. The final blow to the number's reputation came in 1907, when Boston stockbroker Thomas Lawson published a novel titled Friday the 13th. The book told the story of a malicious financier who planned to trigger the collapse of Wall Street on Friday the 13th. The publicity campaign was aggressive. It sold almost 28,000 copies in its first week alone. In 1916, it was adapted into a silent film. From that point onward, Friday the 13th ceased to be a vague concern among superstitious people and became a named cultural event. The term paraskevidekatriophobia, created to describe the specific fear of that day, entered medical dictionaries. Contemporary estimates suggest that Friday the 13th causes annual losses of between $700 and $800 million in tourism, commerce, and services in the United States alone, because millions of people avoid traveling, purchasing property, scheduling surgery, or signing contracts on that date. The belief became measurable economics. It was within this cultural environment that the elevator industry made a quiet decision that would shape the American vertical landscape for the following century. The Otis Elevator Company, founded in New York in 1853, is the world's largest elevator manufacturer and has dominated the American skyscraper market for more than a century. In 2002, company product manager Dilip Rangnekar revealed the figures from an internal review. Among elevators installed by Otis in buildings with 13 stories or more, 85% did not have a button for the 13th floor. It simply did not exist. The control panel jumped directly from 12 to 14, even though that second button controlled a motor carrying the elevator through exactly the same vertical distance any engineer would identify as the 13th floor. The engineering knew the truth. The panel lied, and the real estate market was grateful. Research by the real estate consultancy Realting found that apartments labeled as being on the 13th floor sell, on average, 18% less frequently than units on other levels of the same building. A Gallup study from 2007 found that 13% of American adults, a figure that became a joke among statisticians, would feel uncomfortable spending the night in a hotel room bearing that number. 1 in 10 would refuse to sleep there altogether. The physics of the situation is amusing when you stop to consider it. You are standing inside a metal box, roughly 8 feet by 6.5 feet, suspended by braided steel cables and rising through the interior of a glass and concrete tower. The motor pulling the cab is the same. The distance between the 12th floor and the next level is mathematically identical, roughly 10 feet. Calling it 13 or 14 does not alter a single law of solid mechanics. But the human brain behaves like a distracted driver in traffic. It does not see the motor. It sees the button. And if the button says 14, the passenger processes the information as 14. It is a perceptual trick similar to a chef adding the same salt to 2 identical pans, then charging $10 more for the one described as artisanal risotto. Nothing changes in the ingredients, only the label changes, and in the consumer's mind, the label changes the price. The modern consolidation of this practice has produced consequences the original developers never anticipated. Buildings that omit the 13th floor create genuine confusion for firefighters and paramedics. An emergency call from the 14th floor requires the team to determine within seconds whether the caller means the 14th physical level counted from the street or the renamed 13th floor. In a high-rise, being off by 1 story during a medical emergency can cost precious minutes. Historians encounter the same problem on a different scale. Andrew Dolkart, a Columbia University professor and specialist in historic preservation, has explained in interviews that when surveying older New York buildings, he frequently finds discrepancies between the official number of stories listed in the records and the actual physical count, precisely because someone decided to erase 13 at some point during the 20th century. This confusion led the city of Vancouver, Canada, to legally prohibit the omission of floor numbers in new buildings in 2015. The decision was based on safety, not cultural skepticism. If an elevator panel does not correspond to the physical reality of the building, planners argued, then the panel itself becomes a problem. It is worth noting that the fear of 13 is essentially Western. On the other side of the planet, in China, Japan, and South Korea, the feared number is 4. In Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, the word for 4 sounds almost identical to the word for death. This is known as tetraphobia, and it produces even more dramatic effects on architecture. Many buildings in Shanghai, Tokyo, and Seoul skip not only the 4th floor, but every level ending in 4. No 4, no 14, no 24, and sometimes nothing from 40 onward. A study of Vancouver's real estate market, in a city with a large Asian immigrant population, found that homes with the number 4 in their address sell at an average discount of 2.2%, while homes bearing the number 8, associated with prosperity and Mandarin, cost an average of 2.5% more. Superstition has a listed price, and it is fascinating to see how, in buildings across neighborhoods such as Flushing, Queens, home to a large Chinese community, some modern developments omit both 4 and 13, blending the two traditions in a quiet accommodation of capital to fear. The most famous recent example of this superstition persisting in contemporary New York involved television host Andy Cohen, who sold his duplex apartment in the West Village for $10.5 million in 2022. The unit had a peculiar configuration. The living areas were on the 12th floor, while the bedrooms and office were on the 14th. The 13th simply did not exist as an address. Cohen remarked in an interview that living between 12 and 14, knowing he could climb one flight of stairs and cross a floor that officially had no number, was a strange experience. It is architecture as a magic trick. The floor is there. It has walls, pipes, electrical wiring, a floor slab, and someone walking across it. But on the marketing plans, in the elevator, and in the mail, it wears a different identity. It is the nameless floor of a city obsessed with addresses. And here we find a consequence almost no one anticipated. The practice of skipping the 13th floor, which began as a commercial concession during the late 19th century, became a cultural standard extending far beyond buildings. Airlines including Air France, Ryanair, Qatar Airways, and Singapore Airlines do not have a row 13 on their commercial aircraft. Passengers boarding with a ticket for seat 14A are actually sitting in the 13th physical row from the forward door. Airfares from the United Kingdom to continental Europe on Friday the 13th can be approximately 39% lower than the monthly average because so many people avoid flying on that day that demand falls enough for airlines to reduce their prices. Hospitals in many American cities avoid assigning the number 13 to patient rooms. Some modern skyscrapers, even those built during the 2020s, continue the practice, although a new generation of architects is beginning to resist it. In 2023, Corcoran real estate agent Sydney Blumstein said she had noticed the opposite trend among younger buyers, particularly those immersed in digital culture. They were reclaiming the 13th floor as something positive, a mark of individuality and a small rebellion against the superstitious legacy of their parents. New towers such as 56 Leonard and 1 Madison Park still skip the number. But an increasing number of developments, particularly those targeting an international audience of Asian buyers, Eastern Europeans, or people who simply find the practice ridiculous, are restoring the 13 button to their elevators. Now, return to the opening scene. You are standing in the lobby of a Manhattan apartment building, one of those post-war brick developments with a doorman's desk, and a worn sofa. You enter the elevator and press the button for the 14th floor. The cab rises silently, and for the first time, you notice that the panel jumps directly from 12 to 14. Now you know that the motor is traveling along exactly the same section of guide rail it would follow if the button said 13. You know that at some point between 1900 and 1950, someone decided the label was a problem. You know that the decision emerged from a mixture of fragments. Norse mythology, a Last Supper recounted in Aramaic 2,000 years ago, a Friday in October of 1307, a novel about the stock market published in Boston in 1907, and a commercial calculation made by a New York elevator company that discovered, during the late 19th century, that manipulating perception was easier than confronting superstition. Architecture has the strange quality of being both the most rational and the most irrational of the practical arts. The calculations are exact. The cables support specific loads. The floor slabs have engineered thicknesses. But buildings must also be inhabited by human beings, and human beings carry 3,000 years of cultural ghosts inside their minds. Engineering constructs the building. Superstition names the floors. And occasionally, on an elevator panel in Manhattan, these two forces appear side by side, as close together as the button for 12 and the button for 14. If this is the kind of content that interests you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I will see you in the next video.